Welcome to a story of cold, power, and survival. Imagine standing on the snow-covered streets of Moscow, the temperature plunging far below freezing, your breath turning to mist in the bitter air. The quiet of the city is eerie, almost suffocating. The winter has wrapped the world in its icy embrace, yet beneath this stillness, a storm of power, corruption, and ruthless ambition brews in the shadows. This is the world of the Russian Mafia, where the cold of winter doesn't freeze their resolve, it only sharpens it. In a place where the winds howl and the streets are blanketed in snow, most would seek warmth and shelter, but not the Russian Mafia. For them, winter is just another challenge to conquer, another environment to navigate in their relentless pursuit of power. In the heart of Russia's harsh winters, these criminal empires found ways to thrive, exploiting every opportunity the long, cold months offered. As you picture yourself immersed in the frozen landscape of Russia, it's important to understand the forces at play beneath the surface. The Russian Mafia did not simply emerge out of thin air, they grew from the ashes of a crumbling empire, taking advantage of the chaos following the collapse of the Soviet Union. What began as a chaotic underworld soon evolved into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, and no amount of snow or ice could slow their rise. To understand the power and resilience of the Russian Mafia, we must go back to the dawn of its existence. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 created a void, a vacuum of power that was quickly filled by a new kind of force: organized crime. As the Soviet government crumbled, many who had been involved in the underground economy found ways to gain control in the new, lawless world of post-Soviet Russia. The Mafia's rise was swift and brutal. What had once been small, fragmented criminal groups transformed into highly structured and organized syndicates. These groups were not limited to petty thieves or small-time crooks. They were composed of powerful individuals with connections to the highest levels of government, business, and even the military. This allowed the Russian Mafia to spread its influence far beyond the borders of Russia, reaching into Europe, the United States, and other parts of the world. As you think about the Russian Mafia's rise, you must also consider the context in which it thrived: Russia's brutal winters. The temperature regularly drops to -30 degrees Celsius or lower, and the snow piles up, making the world outside look like a frozen wasteland. For most, this would be an unbearable condition, one that would send people inside to the warmth of their homes. But for the Russian Mafia, the cold became a tool. It was a way to operate with less interference, a method to hide their dealings in the shadows of snow-covered streets. As the Soviet government crumbled, many who had been involved in the underground economy found ways to gain control in the new, lawless world of post-Soviet Russia. The Mafia's rise was swift and brutal. What had once been small, fragmented criminal groups transformed into highly structured and organized syndicates. Snow may have made it harder for the police to track them, but it also made it easier for the Mafia to continue their operations unnoticed. The cold, rather than hindering them, became a part of their environment, a challenge to be embraced, not avoided. The Russian Mafia's resilience in the harshest of environments speaks volumes about their power. They are not only a product of the economic chaos of the post-Soviet era, they are survivors. The freezing cold, the unforgiving winters of Russia have shaped them just as much as they have shaped the Russian landscape. Every harsh winter is another test of their strength. another reminder of how they continue to endure where others might fail. As you imagine the Russian Mafia's grip tightening around the country during the bitter winters, know that it is a grip that hasn't loosened. Through violence, corruption, and a brutal determination, they carved out their place in the world. The cold may have been harsh, but it was only one more obstacle they overcame. In a land where the winter could freeze the heart of any ordinary person, the Russian Mafia thrived. So, as you journey through this chilling story, remember that the Russian Mafia's power, much like the Russian winter, is unyielding. It is as cold, as calculated, and as persistent as the snow that blankets the streets. And just like the long, unrelenting winters, their influence is not something that can easily be shaken. They endure, they survive, and they continue to reign from the shadows. Imagine yourself back in the Soviet era, where the state controlled nearly every aspect of life. Beneath this strict control, however, there existed a hidden world of underground activity. The Soviet Union, despite its centralized and authoritarian rule, could not fully suppress the human desire for personal gain and rebellion. In the shadows of this regime, criminal groups began to form small, fragmented, and operating in secrecy. These were the early foundations of what would later evolve into the powerful Russian Mafia. During the Soviet period, these criminal organizations, often referred to as thieves in law, vori versakoni, operated in prison systems, where they maintained their own set of codes and rules independent of the state's authority. They weren't just petty criminals, they were highly disciplined and structured, operating under a strict hierarchy and adhering to their own laws. Their influence began to extend into the underground markets, smuggling goods, and running illegal gambling operations, even as the state tried to crack down on such activities. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 provided a unique opportunity for these groups to grow, as the state was no longer able to exert control over the country's fractured economy and social systems. As the Soviet Union crumbled, so did the structures that kept many of these criminal operations in check. These groups were not limited to petty thieves or small-time crooks. They were composed of powerful individuals with connections to the highest levels of government, business, and even the military. This allowed the Russian Mafia to spread its influence far beyond the borders of Russia, reaching into Europe, the United States, and other parts of the world. As you think about the Russian Mafia's rise, you must also consider the context in which it thrived: Russia's brutal winters. The collapse of the centralized state meant that there were no longer any strong institutions to maintain control over the vast territories that had once been bound by the rigid rules of the communist system. What followed was a chaotic scramble for power, resources, and wealth, an ideal environment for organized crime to thrive. The sudden collapse of the old system created a power vacuum. The once powerful state was no longer in control, and the new political and economic systems that emerged were frail and disorganized. This instability opened the door for criminal organizations, who had already established strong networks within the country's prisons, to step in. The mafia, with its hierarchical structure and rigid codes, had the discipline necessary to navigate the confusion. These criminal groups, particularly the thieves in law, who had operated for decades in secrecy, were now poised to take over industries, businesses, and even local governments that were left vulnerable by the collapse. In the chaotic aftermath of the Soviet Union's fall, privatization swept through Russia at an unprecedented rate. The government, desperate to transform the planned economy into a free market, began selling off state-owned assets, factories, mines, energy companies, and other valuable properties. These assets were often sold for a fraction of their worth, and the new privatization process was riddled with corruption. Here, the Russian Mafia played a pivotal role, stepping in to ensure that these privatizations went in their favor. Through intimidation, bribery, and violence, the Mafia seized control of lucrative businesses and markets, consolidating their power over sectors like energy, construction, and manufacturing. In the emerging capitalist economy, where laws were weak and enforcement even weaker, the Mafia quickly established itself as a dominant force. They infiltrated every corner of the economy, from legitimate businesses to illicit trades. The fall of the Soviet system had left a huge void in governance and law enforcement, and the Mafia filled it. With no central authority to protect the interests of the people, the Mafia took control, offering protection to businesses, organizing extortion rackets, and dominating the black market. As the Russian economy transitioned into a new era, the Russian Mafia expanded its reach not just in Russia, but internationally. With access to the newly privatized wealth and connections within Russia's powerful political and business circles, the Mafia was able to extend its influence far beyond Russia's borders. They forged partnerships with criminal organizations across the globe, particularly in Europe, North America, and the former Soviet states. As the global demand for drugs, weapons, and other illegal commodities increased, the Russian Mafia became deeply involved in trafficking, smuggling, and laundering money. What was once a fragmented and underground criminal network rooted in the prisons of the Soviet Union had now evolved into a powerful, international criminal syndicate with its tentacles in nearly every major global criminal activity. Leaders of the Russian Mafia, such as Semyon Mogilevich, known as the Boss of Bosses, became notorious figures not only in Russia but also in the world of organized crime. Mogilevich and his associates operated with near impunity, controlling illicit trade routes, drug trafficking, and even the stock markets. As the new Russian government struggled to assert control over the country, the Mafia continued to grow in power. The lack of strong legal systems and the rise of oligarchs, many of whom had close ties to the Mafia, allowed these criminal organizations to thrive. Corruption within Russia's new political class further fueled the Mafia's growth, and the public had little recourse. In fact, many citizens began to view the Mafia as a necessary evil, providing protection and order in an otherwise unstable society. The rise of the Russian Mafia in the wake of the Soviet collapse is a direct result of the systemic breakdown that followed. In the absence of a strong central government, these criminal organizations exploited the chaos to expand their control, taking advantage of the weak rule of law, the rapid privatization of state assets, and the disillusionment of the people. As the Russian Mafia grew in power, it solidified its place as one of the most influential criminal organizations in history, an empire built not just on crime, but on the exploitation of a fractured nation's instability. This period marked the beginning of a new chapter in Russian criminal history. What had once been confined to the back alleys of the Soviet prison system was now shaping the very fabric of Russian society. with the mafia's influence stretching into every corner of the country. The legacy of this power struggle, set in motion by the collapse of the Soviet Union, would continue to influence Russia's political and economic landscape for decades to come. The once powerful state was no longer in control, and the new political and economic systems that emerged were frail and disorganized. This instability opened the door for criminal organizations who had already established strong networks within the country's prisons to step in. The mafia, with its hierarchical structure and rigid codes, had the discipline necessary to navigate the confusion. One of the most notorious groups that rose to prominence was the Solntsevskaya Bratva, one of the largest and most powerful factions within the Russian Mafia. With their roots in Moscow, the Solntsevskaya gang became synonymous with the rise of the Russian Mafia, controlling everything from drug trafficking to money laundering. Led by figures such as Vyacheslav Ivankov, nicknamed Yaponchik, the gang expanded its influence both within Russia and internationally. Another key player was the Chechen Mafia, which gained power in the 1990 seconds. Known for their ruthlessness and willingness to use violence to achieve their goals, the Chechen gangs were heavily involved in smuggling, extortion, and oil theft. Leaders like Shamil Basayev and Ruslan Gelayev became infamous, not just for their criminal activities, but for their involvement in regional conflicts, making the Chechen Mafia a significant player on both the criminal and political stages. However, it wasn't just these criminal organizations that shaped the Russian Mafia. There were also smaller, regional gangs, each with their own leaders and territories, often centered around specific cities or industries. These leaders, with names like Semyon Mogilevich and Arkady Gaidamak, played pivotal roles in solidifying the mafia's power in various parts of Russia and beyond. These smaller, regional gangs were often more specialized, controlling specific sectors of the economy or regions of Russia. For instance, Semyon Mogilevich, widely known as the boss of bosses, emerged as one of the most infamous figures in the Russian Mafia. With a vast network of criminal enterprises, Mogilevich built his empire on a combination of financial fraud, arms dealing, and money laundering. One of the most notorious groups that rose to prominence was the Solntsevskaya Bratva, one of the largest and most powerful factions within the Russian Mafia. With their roots in Moscow, the Solntsevskaya gang became synonymous with the rise of the Russian Mafia, controlling everything from drug trafficking to money laundering. Led by figures such as Vyacheslav Ivankov, nicknamed Yaponchik, the gang expanded its influence both within Russia and internationally. Originally from Ukraine, Gaidamak was involved in a wide range of criminal activities, including arms dealing, illegal trade, and financial schemes. His deep ties to the political elites of Russia and Israel allowed him to maintain his power and extend his influence beyond the borders of Russia. Gaidamak's ability to navigate the political landscape and avoid legal consequences was a testament to the mafia's reach, which by now had infiltrated many layers of society. The rise of these figures and their organizations was not just about the strength of individual leaders. It was a reflection of a wider phenomenon in post-Soviet Russia, the intertwining of criminal enterprises with state power. The sudden collapse of the centralized Soviet government created an environment where business and politics were no longer governed by clear rules, and the Russian Mafia, with its disciplined structure and vast resources, was uniquely positioned to step in. As the country scrambled to find its footing, criminal groups filled the power vacuum, often forming alliances with corrupt politicians and law enforcement officers who were either unwilling or unable to maintain control over the chaotic new capitalist economy. These alliances, which blurred the lines between criminal and political power, allowed the Russian Mafia to operate with relative impunity. The Mafia not only became powerful but also began to shape the country's economic and political systems. They dominated key industries like oil, gas, metals, and construction, and through bribery, intimidation, and violence, they managed to take control of massive swathes of the Russian economy. The Russian government, though aware of the Mafia's growing power, was often either unwilling or unable to intervene. The lack of a cohesive legal system, widespread corruption, and the emergence of oligarchs, wealthy individuals who amassed power through privatization, created a situation where the Russian Mafia could thrive unchecked. The 1990 seconds were a particularly violent time, marked by brutal turf wars between rival gangs, as well as the constant risk of assassination or violent retribution for those who crossed the wrong people. As these criminal organizations grew in power, they expanded their reach beyond the borders of Russia. The Russian Mafia's international network became a force to be reckoned with, as it established operations in Europe, the United States, and even Asia. With global reach came global influence, and the Russian Mafia became involved in a variety of international crimes, including drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and human trafficking. This symbiotic relationship between organized crime and the state allowed the Russian Mafia to thrive, even as the country's political structure began to stabilize under President Vladimir Putin's administration. Putin's rise to power in the early 2000s brought a new dynamic to the Russian Mafia. While his government cracked down on some aspects of organized crime, it was clear that the Mafia had already become too powerful to eradicate entirely. By the end of the 1990 seconds and into the early 2000s, the Russian Mafia had become so deeply entrenched in the fabric of Russian society that it was almost impossible to distinguish the legal from the illegal. The lines between politics, business, and crime were increasingly blurred, with Mafia-linked oligarchs influencing key political decisions. The lack of a cohesive legal system, widespread corruption, and the emergence of oligarchs, wealthy individuals who amassed power through privatization, created a situation where the Russian Mafia could thrive unchecked. The 1990 seconds were a particularly violent time, marked by brutal turf wars between rival gangs, as well as the constant risk of assassination or violent retribution for those who crossed the wrong people. Instead, the government, particularly in its early years, worked with the Mafia in a more transactional manner, using their influence to maintain control over certain regions and industries. The relationship between the state and the Mafia is a complex one, where power, influence, and violence are often intertwined. While the Russian Mafia remains a shadowy and illegal force, it has also become an integral part of the country's political and economic systems, continuing to shape Russia's development and global position. Their deep involvement in virtually every aspect of Russian life, business, politics, and law enforcement means that their power remains as formidable as ever. The rise of the Russian Mafia is not just a story of criminal enterprise. It is a tale of adaptation, survival, and the exploitation of societal breakdown. The collapse of the Soviet Union may have fragmented the country, but it created the perfect conditions for the rise of an underground empire that would come to define post-Soviet Russia. From a collection of underground groups to a powerful and global network, the Russian Mafia's rise is one of the most fascinating and chilling stories of organized crime in modern history. As you consider the rise of the Russian Mafia, it's important to understand the socio-political conditions that enabled its rapid expansion. The economic collapse of the Soviet Union created a power vacuum, and this lack of central authority created a fertile ground for criminal gangs to grow in influence. In the West, the Russian Mafia was often associated with violence and ruthlessness, and their operations in cities like New York and London were notorious. The Mafia's ability to launder money, invest in legitimate businesses, and exploit the global economy made them a significant player in international organized crime. They forged relationships with other criminal organizations around the world, cementing their place as a global powerhouse. Industries such as oil, gas, metals, and even banking became targets for mafia infiltration. The collapse of the Soviet Union also brought about widespread poverty and unemployment. Many former state workers found themselves out of jobs and with few opportunities to earn a living. In this environment, criminal organizations offered both employment and protection. The sudden shift from a centralized, state-controlled economy to an open market left many people without the security they once had. This chaos led to an explosion in private enterprise, but without regulations or a legal framework, many business ventures were immediately co-opted by criminal elements. The state's inability to provide oversight left large sectors of the economy open to exploitation by the mafia. The absence of a functioning legal system meant that criminal gangs could operate with impunity, effectively running parallel governments in many parts of Russia. In the midst of this chaos, the Russian Mafia seized its opportunity to not only survive, but to thrive. With the state's weakening grip on power, the vacuum was filled by those who were quick to exploit the instability. Criminal organizations that had been operating in the shadows during the Soviet era now took center stage. They offered more than just illicit goods and services. They provided a sense of stability and order in a country that was rapidly descending into an economic and social abyss. As you imagine yourself in post-Soviet Russia, where the old Soviet regime's promises of security and prosperity had vanished, you begin to understand the appeal of the Russian Mafia for many people. In a country where hyperinflation and shortages were widespread, the Mafia's role was not just criminal, but also societal. They controlled key industries, ran illicit businesses, and offered a form of protection in a world where the government no longer seemed capable of providing it. For those desperate for employment or security, the Mafia became an indispensable part of everyday life. It was not uncommon for business owners to pay protection money to avoid sabotage or robbery, and the Mafia's influence reached deep into all sectors of society, from the smallest shopkeepers to the largest factories. With its increasing control over critical industries such as oil, gas, and metals, the Russian Mafia quickly became the invisible hand that shaped Russia's economic recovery. Though the state was officially privatizing industries, the Mafia quickly infiltrated these ventures. Through a combination of threats, bribery, and insider knowledge, criminal organizations managed to secure the most valuable assets for themselves, taking control of vast resources. For example, in the oil industry, Mafia-backed companies often acquired large state-owned enterprises through corrupt deals and fraudulent privatization processes, effectively gaining control over one of Russia's most lucrative sectors. The banking sector, too, became a fertile ground for mafia infiltration. With the lack of strong regulatory oversight, criminal organizations were able to launder money, manipulate the stock market, and siphon off wealth from the state's privatization efforts. The absence of a cohesive legal framework allowed the Russian mafia to operate unchecked, consolidating power by making connections with influential oligarchs, corrupt politicians, and law enforcement officers. As the Russian government struggled to establish itself in this new capitalist environment, the mafia began to operate almost like a parallel government. In regions and cities where the state's reach was limited, criminal groups filled the power vacuum. They enforced their own laws, made their own rules, and handled disputes with violence or coercion. These criminal groups, in essence, became local authorities, offering protection and resolving conflicts in the absence of functional state institutions. In some cases, the Russian mafia didn't just fill the gap left by the state's collapse, they became the new system of control. Many of the newly wealthy business tycoons, often former Communist Party members or government insiders, had deep ties to the mafia. These individuals, known as oligarchs, used their influence and wealth to secure political power while simultaneously funneling money and resources into the pockets of criminal organizations. The Russian mafia, in turn, protected their interests and expanded their reach, ensuring that the oligarchs remained in power. The country's lack of a functioning legal system during this time meant that those in power, both criminal and political, operated with impunity. If businesses were extorted, or if individuals were harmed, the legal system was either too weak or too corrupt to provide any recourse. Law enforcement officers, many of whom were underpaid and disillusioned, often turned a blind eye to mafia activities, or worse, actively collaborated with them. In some regions, the Russian mafia even began to operate as a form of de facto government, providing social services and protection in areas where the state had failed. They offered jobs, health care, and access to goods and services that were otherwise scarce. For many people, the mafia's presence was simply a fact of life, a necessary evil in a world where the state had all but disappeared. This environment of widespread corruption, economic collapse, and social disarray allowed the Russian mafia to solidify its power. As the 1990 seconds wore on, the mafia's influence became more entrenched, and its grip on the Russian economy and political system grew stronger. The connections between organized crime, government officials, and businessmen became increasingly difficult to untangle. What had started as a small network of criminals in Soviet-era prisons had transformed into a sprawling global network of organized crime that would come to define the post-Soviet era. As you reflect on this time, it becomes clear that the Russian mafia's rapid rise was not merely the result of criminal ingenuity. It was a product of the socio-political environment of post-Soviet Russia. In a country struggling to reinvent itself after the fall of communism, the mafia filled a void left by the collapse of the Soviet state. They didn't just adapt to the new capitalist landscape, they shaped it, using violence, intimidation, and political alliances to build an empire that would continue to affect Russia and the world for decades to come. The Russian Mafia's ability to thrive in this environment was a testament to its ruthlessness and adaptability. Where the state faltered, the Mafia filled the gaps, becoming an indispensable part of Russian life and in many ways, an unavoidable force in the country's transition into the 21st century. In the wake of the Soviet collapse, the Russian Mafia transformed from a local phenomenon into a global force. As the gangs grew in strength, they began to expand their operations beyond Russia's borders. The rise of the Mafia wasn't limited to Russian cities. It reached into international markets, bringing Russian crime to the streets of New York, London, and even Tokyo. As global trade increased, so did the reach of these criminal syndicates. They quickly became involved in everything from drug trafficking to arms dealing and human trafficking. The networks they built spanned continents, with Russian mafia bosses making deals with other international crime organizations. In the 1,990 seconds, it was not unusual for major Russian mafia bosses to have business interests and connections in Western countries. They became an integral part of the international criminal underworld, with their influence being felt across borders. The Mafia's expansion into the global arena was both a sign of their growing power and a reflection of the Russian government's inability to curb their influence. As the Russian Mafia expanded its influence globally, its operations became increasingly sophisticated. The rise of international trade and the growth of the global economy provided new avenues for criminal enterprises to infiltrate. The Russian Mafia capitalized on this, using the same network of corruption, violence, and intimidation that had allowed them to thrive in Russia, to establish their presence in Western countries and beyond. One of the key drivers of the Mafia's global reach was its involvement in money laundering. The influx of vast sums of money from illegal activities such as drug trafficking, arms dealing, and extortion needed to be cleaned and integrated into legitimate financial systems. The Russian Mafia set up a complex web of front companies, offshore accounts, and international partnerships to launder their illicit profits, often using Western financial institutions and markets. Cities like London, New York, and even smaller financial hubs like Cyprus became key centers for this operation, allowing the Mafia to operate under the radar of law enforcement agencies. The Mafia's presence in Western countries wasn't limited to financial crimes. They quickly became involved in the drug trade, particularly in the trafficking of heroin and cocaine. Russian criminal organizations established smuggling routes, often collaborating with other international criminal groups, such as the Colombian drug cartels. The sophisticated networks they built allowed them to transport vast quantities of drugs across borders, from Central Asia and Europe to the United States. These trafficking routes were often masked by legitimate shipping businesses, making it difficult for authorities to track. The arms trade also became a significant part of the Russian Mafia's international activities. The collapse of the Soviet Union left a vast stockpile of weapons ranging from small arms to more sophisticated military-grade equipment. The Russian Mafia, with its ties to corrupt officials, was able to gain access to these weapons and sell them on the international black market. In some cases, they even provided arms to conflict zones around the world, fueling wars and civil unrest in places like Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Their ability to operate in these volatile regions further cemented their status as a global criminal force. Another lucrative enterprise for the Russian Mafia was human trafficking. With millions of people displaced by war, economic collapse, and social unrest, the Russian Mafia found a steady supply of vulnerable individuals to exploit. Women and children, often from former Soviet republics, were trafficked across Europe and into the United States for forced labor, sexual exploitation, and slavery. The Mafia used their networks to transport and control these victims, operating in a manner that was both brutal and highly organized. The 1990 seconds also saw the rise of the Russian oligarchs, wealthy business tycoons who had ties to the Russian Mafia. Many of these individuals had connections to both the criminal underworld and the political elites, allowing them to amass huge fortunes during Russia's chaotic transition to capitalism. These oligarchs often used their wealth and connections to protect their business interests, engaging in bribery, extortion, and even violence to maintain their dominance. Some of them had direct dealings with mafia leaders, using them to settle disputes, eliminate competition, or secure lucrative government contracts. The Russian Mafia's ability to infiltrate the business world and form alliances with political figures in both Russia and abroad gave them a unique position in the global criminal ecosystem. Their connections with powerful figures allowed them to operate with relative impunity, as they were often protected by corrupt officials or influential business partners. This made it difficult for law enforcement agencies in both Russia and the West to take meaningful action against them. The Russian Mafia was not just a criminal organization. It was a political and economic force in its own right. By the turn of the 21st century, the Russian Mafia had become deeply integrated into the fabric of global organized crime. Their involvement in various illicit enterprises, from drug trafficking to arms smuggling, made them one of the most formidable criminal syndicates in the world. Their ability to operate across borders, often with the protection of corrupt officials and business leaders, made them nearly untouchable. As the international community struggled to combat organized crime, the Russian Mafia continued to expand, consolidating its position as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. This expansion into the global arena marked the Russian Mafia's evolution from a regional phenomenon into a true transnational criminal empire. Their reach was now felt across continents, and their ability to operate with impunity in multiple countries signaled the growing influence of organized crime in the post-Soviet era. The Russian Mafia had become more than just a Russian problem. It was a global issue with profound implications for international security, business, and law enforcement. In the years that followed, the Russian Mafia's global network would continue to adapt and evolve. As law enforcement agencies in the West began to crack down on their activities, the Mafia adapted by shifting their operations to new regions and utilizing more sophisticated technology and methods. But despite these efforts to counter their influence, the Russian Mafia's legacy of power, corruption, and global reach remains a defining feature of the post-Soviet world. Picture yourself standing in the middle of a Russian winter. The cold is unlike anything you've ever experienced, biting at your skin with a sharpness that seems to cut through even the heaviest of clothing. Temperatures regularly drop below -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the most extreme conditions, it can plummet even further. The snow never seems to stop falling, piling up in thick layers that make it nearly impossible to navigate the streets without trudging through deep drifts. The air is crisp, so cold it feels like it might freeze your breath mid-exhale. In cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, the winter months can last from October to April, with the sun barely making an appearance. The endless gray skies cast a haunting pall over the landscape, and the heavy, suffocating silence of snow-covered streets is almost eerie. The cold is relentless, turning everyday life into a battle against nature's harshness. For most people, these conditions mean staying indoors, huddled by a fire, wrapped in blankets, trying to keep warm. Yet, for the Russian Mafia, this bleak and unforgiving weather presented both a challenge and an opportunity. The winter months were harsh, but they were nothing more than another obstacle to navigate in their criminal world. The cold may have made daily life harder for ordinary Russians, but for the Mafia, it was just another factor to adapt to as they continued their activities. While the rest of the population huddled inside, the Russian Mafia saw winter as a time to capitalize on the quieter, less bustling streets. For them, the snow and cold were not barriers, but opportunities to operate undetected. The absence of people in the streets during the long winter nights made it easier to carry out their operations without drawing attention. The usual distractions of daily life, such as busy markets and social gatherings, were replaced with an eerie stillness, allowing criminal activities to unfold with minimal interference. As the freezing temperatures made it difficult for regular businesses to function, the Mafia took control of the industries that continued to thrive in these conditions. Illegal smuggling operations, money laundering, and extortion were conducted behind closed doors, often under the cover of snow-covered vehicles or hidden shipments disguised as legitimate goods. The Mafia adapted their strategies to move products, whether drugs, weapons, or stolen goods, using remote routes that were less likely to be monitored by authorities during the winter months. They used the cover of darkness and heavy snow to conceal their movements, making it almost impossible for law enforcement to follow their trails. For those in the criminal world, the weather provided both protection and cover. The silence of snow-drifted streets muffled the sounds of vehicles transporting illicit goods or conducting deals. The usual distractions of daily life, such as busy markets and social gatherings, were replaced with an eerie stillness, allowing criminal activities to unfold with minimal interference. As the freezing temperatures made it difficult for regular businesses to function, the Mafia took control of the industries that continued to thrive in these conditions. The Mafia's network thrived in this environment, where many businesses struggled to survive. Those who couldn't make ends meet during the economic chaos of post-Soviet Russia often turned to criminal organizations for protection or employment. The cold of winter intensified the harsh realities of daily life, making people more vulnerable to the Mafia's control. For many, joining a criminal gang or working for one was a survival strategy. The Mafia didn't just offer illegal activities. They provided something that the state could no longer guarantee: security and stability, even in the dead of winter. Moreover, the Mafia adapted to the challenges that came with the frigid conditions. Transportation became a logistical challenge, but it also presented an opportunity for further control. The Mafia's well-established network of drivers, many of whom were experienced in navigating Russia's icy roads, ensured that criminal operations continued without interruption. The vehicles used by the Mafia were equipped for the harshest conditions, ensuring that even during heavy snowstorms, shipments could be delivered and deals executed. But perhaps the most significant advantage the Mafia gained from Russia's brutal winters was the psychological impact it had on people. The cold, isolation, and relentless nature of the season created a sense of helplessness and vulnerability in the general population. This played into the hands of the Mafia, as their presence began to feel like a necessary evil for survival. While the rest of Russia struggled with the physical toll of the winter, the Mafia thrived, adapting their tactics and methods to make sure their influence grew stronger with every passing snowstorm. For the Russian Mafia, winter was no mere challenge, it was a time of opportunity. It was a season to move operations underground, both literally and figuratively, using the harsh weather as a cover to expand their reach. While the rest of the country hunkered down to wait out the cold, the Mafia adapted, using the season's isolation and quiet to reinforce their grip on the economy, politics, and everyday life. In cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, the winter months can last from October to April, with the sun barely making an appearance. The endless gray skies cast a haunting pall over the landscape, and the heavy, suffocating silence of snow-covered streets is almost eerie. The cold is relentless, turning everyday life into a battle against nature's harshness. For most people, these conditions mean staying indoors, huddled by a fire, wrapped in blankets, trying to keep warm. The chaotic conditions of post-Soviet Russia, with its disorganized government and fractured economy, made it an ideal time for the criminal underworld to solidify its power, and the winter months provided a cover. Criminal gangs like the Russian Mafia were already highly structured, but the harsh winter months tested their resilience and resourcefulness. While most businesses ground to a halt, the Mafia adapted by expanding their operations underground, both literally and figuratively. Criminal activities, smuggling, extortion, and illegal trafficking continued through the cold months, albeit with an altered approach. For one, the Mafia's operations became more covert. In a country where visibility was low due to heavy snow and short daylight hours, the Mafia used this to their advantage, moving undetected through snow-covered streets. They would often operate in the dead of night when the streets were deserted, and the snow muffled the sounds of their vehicles. Many operations, from transporting goods to settling disputes, were carried out under the cover of darkness, where the cold provided a natural barrier to unwanted attention. Moreover, the Mafia's adaptability extended to their logistical operations. Transportation, which was often complicated by the snow, was managed through modified vehicles designed to handle Russia's harsh winters. Mafia groups relied on a network of trusted drivers familiar with navigating the icy roads. Many of the most critical shipments, whether arms or illicit goods, would be done in secrecy, hidden beneath blankets of snow or within the cargo of seemingly legitimate deliveries. The Russian Mafia's ability to adapt their transportation methods during the winter months was essential to maintaining their operations. While most of the population struggled to cope with the harsh conditions, the Mafia turned the winter landscape into a network of hidden pathways for illicit activity. They made use of remote areas, often traversing through forests, abandoned roads, or even frozen rivers, taking advantage of the snow to mask their movements. These routes, rarely used by others, allowed the Mafia to bypass law enforcement patrols and travel undetected. At times, the criminal organizations would employ specialized vehicles, those equipped with all-terrain capabilities, such as snowmobiles or heavy-duty trucks designed specifically for the Russian winter. These vehicles, often modified to navigate the treacherous, ice-covered roads, ensured that no shipment was delayed, no deal was interrupted. The Mafia's network of drivers, who were familiar with the terrain, became key players in this winter strategy, often operating in secrecy and avoiding major highways to remain off the radar. The snow, while creating a blanket of isolation, also provided the perfect cover for smuggling operations. Large shipments of drugs, weapons, or stolen goods could be hidden under the snow, transported in unmarked trucks or containers that blended seamlessly into the winter landscape. The freezing temperatures made it difficult for authorities to track shipments in the same way they would have during warmer months. The cold, paired with the Mafia's carefully coordinated movements, created an almost impenetrable cover. While other businesses slowed down or closed for the season, the Mafia remained operational, utilizing the stillness and quiet of the winter months to conduct their work under the radar. For the Mafia, the winter was also an ideal time to conduct internal operations, such as debt collections or enforcement of protection rackets. In a world where many were desperate for survival, the Mafia's offer of security became even more valuable during these tough months. As people retreated indoors, the criminal groups took advantage of this isolation, operating in the shadows and using the harsh conditions to force compliance. The silence of the streets made it easier to intimidate and control, knowing that any outcry would likely go unheard in the still, cold night. On top of these physical adaptations, the Mafia also learned to navigate the psychological impact of the winter. The cold and isolation created a sense of vulnerability among the population, and the Mafia capitalized on this fear and discomfort. Many people, struggling to make ends meet in the face of extreme conditions, saw the Mafia as a necessary evil. For the Mafia, the winter was more than just a time to continue business. It was a time to reinforce their power, striking fear into those who were already struggling against the brutal elements. Their presence in the community became more pronounced, as they were not just surviving the winter, but thriving in it. Criminal operations, too, began to take advantage of the infrastructure that the Mafia had long since established, such as illegal gambling, money laundering, and extortion. While legitimate businesses closed down during the winter, the Mafia's underground economy continued to grow. With people confined to their homes due to the cold, they were more likely to fall victim to these illicit businesses. Extortion schemes became more prevalent, with the Mafia demanding money from businesses that could no longer afford to remain open or from individuals who were struggling to survive. In some cases, the Mafia even capitalized on the winter weather to create new opportunities. With many people unable to travel or find work, the criminal gangs opened up new businesses to exploit the situation, whether it was offering fake employment opportunities, controlling the sale of scarce resources like heating oil, or providing protection from other criminals who also took advantage of the chaos. These new ventures allowed the Mafia to expand their control over more areas of life, making themselves indispensable to those who had nowhere else to turn. As the winter months wore on, the Mafia's operations became more entrenched in the social fabric. The cold became less of a hindrance and more of an ally in their rise to power. They used the environment to their advantage, adapting their criminal methods to work within the limitations of the weather, while simultaneously using the isolation to grow their influence. whether it was controlling the flow of goods, asserting dominance in local neighborhoods, or taking advantage of the chaos brought on by the collapse of the Soviet system. The Russian Mafia proved that they could thrive even in the most inhospitable conditions. In the end, the Russian winter became a symbol of the Mafia's resilience. While it tested the limits of the average Russian citizen, it became an opportunity for the Russian Mafia to extend its reach further, proving that in a country where the weather could cripple everyday life, the Mafia could continue to operate, adapt, and grow stronger. The cold may have slowed most, but it only hardened the Mafia's resolve and expanded their grip on the nation. The long winters of Russia, rather than defeating them, served to reinforce the criminal empire that would shape the country for decades to come. The Russian winter didn't just force the Mafia to adapt, it gave them a tactical advantage. For those involved in criminal activities, the snow and cold acted as a natural cloak, hiding operations that would otherwise attract unwanted attention. The quiet, snow-covered streets, with few people braving the cold, allowed criminals to carry out their business undetected. Imagine it, streets that are nearly empty, save for the occasional person bundled up against the cold. The only sounds are the soft crunch of snow beneath boots and the distant hum of a car engine struggling through the deep snow. It's the perfect cover for the Mafia to operate in secrecy. While law enforcement would typically be spread thin in the winter months, trying to handle the widespread chaos of snow removal, power outages, and traffic, the Mafia was able to move freely, unnoticed by the authorities. For example, many Mafia-run businesses such as illicit trading, black market deals, or even acts of extortion could be carried out with little to no interference. The cold was an added layer of protection. Fewer people were out on the streets, and the long winter nights allowed for longer windows of opportunity for criminal activity. The dark, cold streets became the ideal backdrop for some of the Mafia's most profitable and dangerous operations. Snow also served as a physical barrier. When it covered the streets, it blocked public access and made it more difficult for the police to conduct surveillance or chase down criminals. The quiet, snow-covered streets, with few people braving the cold, allowed criminals to carry out their business undetected. Imagine it, streets that are nearly empty, save for the occasional person bundled up against the cold. The only sounds are the soft crunch of snow beneath boots and the distant hum of a car engine struggling through the deep snow. It's the perfect cover for the Mafia to operate in secrecy. Beyond just the physical cover that winter provided, the Russian Mafia learned to strategically use the weather to their advantage, turning a season of hardship into one of opportunity. The harsh Russian winters, with their frozen lakes and snow-covered forests, offered new routes for smuggling and trafficking. While transportation and movement were difficult for the average citizen, they were part of the Mafia's world. They used these weather conditions to create new, hidden pathways. For instance, smuggling routes could shift from busy highways to quieter, less traveled roads or even remote mountain paths. The snow-covered countryside offered Mafia groups the chance to transport goods away from prying eyes, using the weather as a shield to obscure their operations. This shift made it harder for authorities to track movements and intercept shipments. Moreover, Mafia operations weren't limited to just dealing with goods. They were also engaged in extortion and debt collection. The cold weather, paired with the Mafia's established network of intimidation, provided the perfect backdrop for these operations. The threat of violence in such extreme conditions, especially in the isolated areas of the country, made it even more effective. People who were struggling to survive in the harsh conditions were more likely to comply with the mafia's demands, as they had little power to oppose them. In a world where the cold could be crippling to the everyday person, the Russian Mafia turned it into an advantage. By learning to operate under the cover of snow, using the weather to hide their movements, and adapting to the challenges the winter posed, they became even more effective in their criminal endeavors. The harsh winter conditions of Russia, far from deterring the Mafia, became yet another tool in their ever-expanding arsenal. The Russian Mafia's ability to turn winter's challenges into opportunities didn't just stop at smuggling and extortion. The season's harshness also allowed them to engage in more covert and organized criminal activities, taking advantage of the limited mobility of their rivals in law enforcement. During the long winter months, when movement was slow and visibility was poor, the Mafia used this as a tactical advantage to carry out secretive dealings and eliminate competition without fear of interference. One particularly effective strategy involved using the snow-covered landscape to hide illegal assets, such as weapons, cash, or stolen goods. In Russia's vast, often desolate countryside, Mafia groups knew how to exploit the landscape to conceal their operations. In remote forests or frozen lakes, hidden bunkers were constructed away from the prying eyes of law enforcement or rival gangs. The thick blanket of snow provided a natural camouflage, making it nearly impossible for outsiders to detect the hidden caches. This ensured that the Mafia could continue their operations without the risk of being uncovered. Furthermore, winter provided an opportunity to create temporary safe houses in isolated locations, homes, or buildings tucked away in the countryside, where Mafia members could rest or hold meetings far from city centers. These properties were often chosen for their seclusion, accessible only by snowmobile or specialized vehicles designed to navigate the frozen terrain. The Mafia, familiar with the winter environment, could easily access these locations without raising suspicion, while ensuring that their activities remained undetected. In the urban centers, the Mafia's strategic use of winter conditions allowed them to further cement their control over local businesses. With many smaller businesses struggling to stay afloat during the winter months, the Mafia swooped in to offer protection, often demanding a percentage of profits or full control of operations in exchange for security. For many shopkeepers and business owners, the risk of being targeted by violent criminals during the winter months outweighed the cost of paying the Mafia. The cold winter, which already made survival more difficult, created a perfect environment for Mafia extortion to thrive. For instance, smuggling routes could shift from busy highways to quieter, less traveled roads or even remote mountain paths. The snow-covered countryside offered Mafia groups the chance to transport goods away from prying eyes, using the weather as a shield to obscure their operations. This shift made it harder for authorities to track movements and intercept shipments. For instance, smuggling routes could shift from busy highways to quieter, less traveled roads or even remote mountain paths. The snow-covered countryside offered Mafia groups the chance to transport goods away from prying eyes, using the weather as a shield to obscure their operations. This shift made it harder for authorities to track movements and intercept shipments. Snowstorms, which could block roads and disrupt public transportation, further impeded police movement. During this time, the Mafia became more emboldened, knowing that they could operate with less interference from the authorities. Winter also provided a unique opportunity for mafia factions to consolidate their power. With fewer opportunities for public social interactions and fewer distractions during the cold months, rival criminal groups were often forced into quieter negotiations. This presented the Russian Mafia with an ideal time to broker new deals, settle disputes, or expand their territories without attracting the attention they might receive during busier seasons. It was also a prime time for mafia bosses to solidify relationships with corrupt officials, businessmen, and other influential figures, forging new alliances that would prove beneficial when the weather warmed and more attention was focused on public affairs. For instance, smuggling routes could shift from busy highways to quieter, less traveled roads, or even remote mountain paths. The snow-covered countryside offered mafia groups the chance to transport goods away from prying eyes, using the weather as a shield to obscure their operations. This shift made it harder for authorities to track movements and intercept shipments. As you reflect on the way the Russian Mafia adapted to the winter, it becomes clear that their success was rooted in their ability to turn every aspect of the environment to their advantage. The freezing temperatures, the snow-covered streets, and the isolation of the winter months, which would have defeated most, became tools in the mafia's arsenal, enabling them to further entrench their power and expand their influence. Furthermore, winter provided an opportunity to create temporary safe houses in isolated locations, homes, or buildings tucked away in the countryside, where mafia members could rest or hold meetings far from city centers. These properties were often chosen for their seclusion, accessible only by snowmobile or specialized vehicles designed to navigate the frozen terrain. Their mastery of navigating the harsh winters of Russia was more than a survival strategy. It was the foundation for their enduring influence, both within the country and beyond. As you imagine the bustling streets of Moscow and the quiet canals of St. Petersburg, it's hard to ignore the undercurrent of violence and power struggles that permeated these cities in the 1990s and early 2000s. While these two cities are symbols of Russia's cultural and political power, they were also the epicenters of fierce territorial battles between competing criminal gangs. Moscow, the heart of Russian politics and business, was the most coveted prize. Its wealth, resources, and strategic importance made it a magnet for criminal syndicates from all over the country. Similarly, St. Petersburg, with its port connections and proximity to Europe, became another key battleground. The rising influx of money following the collapse of the Soviet Union, combined with the vacuum of power left by the state, meant that both cities became prime targets for mafia groups seeking to control the country's economic and political systems. During this period, Moscow and St. Petersburg were rife with competing criminal factions, each trying to establish dominance over lucrative industries like oil, construction, and arms trading. Some of the most powerful gangs, including the Soltsevskaya Bratva and the Chechen Mafia, battled it out for control over the city's economic lifeblood. Rival factions would use intimidation, violence, and manipulation to outmaneuver each other, while law enforcement, often compromised by corruption, struggled to keep order. For the criminal gangs, gaining control of these urban hubs meant access to enormous wealth, as well as significant political power. The streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg became arenas where the cost of failure was often a life, and victory meant unchallenged rule over vast territories. The struggle for control in Moscow and St. Petersburg was not just a battle for power, it was a battle for survival. In this dangerous world, mafia groups fought tooth and nail, employing ruthless tactics to outsmart and overpower their rivals. The stakes were high, as control over these cities meant access to vast wealth and influence that could reach all the way to the Kremlin. For the criminal gangs, this was a game of life or death. The Solntsevskaya Bratva, one of the largest and most powerful factions within the Russian Mafia, had its roots firmly planted in Moscow. By the 1992, it was a force to be reckoned with, dominating the capital's criminal scene. The group was involved in a wide array of illicit activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, money laundering, and arms dealing. Led by figures such as Vyacheslav Ivankov, known as Yaponchik, the Solntsevskaya Bratva sought to solidify its control over Moscow, the heart of Russia's economic and political power. Their influence was so extensive that they infiltrated businesses, government offices, and even law enforcement, creating a web of corruption that made it nearly impossible to break their hold on the city. On the other hand, the Chechen Mafia was rapidly rising to prominence, particularly in the 1992. The Chechens were known for their brutal methods and willingness to use extreme violence to achieve their goals. They didn't shy away from openly using terror and intimidation to claim territory, often resorting to kidnappings, bombings, and murder. The Chechens were heavily involved in the smuggling of arms, human trafficking, and the control of strategic resources, especially in the oil and gas industries. With their roots in the war-torn Caucasus, the Chechens were adept at operating in the shadows, using their knowledge of the region's geography and their fearsome reputation to make their presence known in Moscow and St. Petersburg. These two factions, the Solntsevskaya Bratva and the Chechen Mafia, would come into direct conflict, not only for control over territory but also for control over the resources that flowed through Russia's heartland. The Chechens were particularly aggressive in their pursuit of the oil trade, an industry that had been privatized and was now ripe for the taking. As they began to exert their power in Moscow and the surrounding regions, they quickly clashed with other gangs who had established a foothold there, including the Solntsevskaya Bratva. This led to a series of violent and bloody confrontations that would define the decade. While these two groups vied for dominance, there were also other factions, smaller but equally dangerous, lurking in the shadows. These included the Tambov gang and the Makachkala Mafia, which also sought to carve out their share of the city's lucrative criminal opportunities. These gangs, while not as powerful as the Solntsevskaya or the Chechens, were no less vicious in their efforts to control certain neighborhoods, local businesses, or smuggling routes. As the power struggle intensified, the mafia's influence began to seep into every aspect of life in these cities. In addition to their involvement in illicit trades, the criminal syndicates began to run legitimate businesses as well, further entrenching their control over the economy. Construction projects, both legal and illegal, became a lucrative source of income for mafia groups, who would extort contractors and enforce their dominance through threats of violence. Corruption was rampant in post-Soviet Russia, and many officials, from police officers to government ministers, were willing to turn a blind eye to mafia activities in exchange for bribes or other favors. The criminal gangs used their wealth to buy protection, influence, and access to resources. With these officials on their side, the gangs could operate with near impunity, securing their illegal operations while avoiding the scrutiny of law enforcement. While these two cities are symbols of Russia's cultural and political power, they were also the epicenters of fierce territorial battles between competing criminal gangs. Moscow, the heart of Russian politics and business, was the most coveted prize. Its wealth, resources, and strategic importance made it a magnet for criminal syndicates from all over the country. Similarly, St. Petersburg, with its port connections and proximity to Europe, became another key battleground. Law enforcement, underpaid and often compromised, had little means of stopping the wave of violence and corruption that swept through the cities. The police, too often on the payroll of one gang or another, were either unwilling or unable to act against the mafia. The connection between organized crime and the political elite ensured that the mafia could continue to thrive, regardless of the consequences for ordinary citizens. The mafia's violent tactics were not limited to other gangs, but extended to anyone who posed a threat to their control, whether it be a businessman trying to maintain his independence, a police officer investigating their operations, or a rival gang member trying to assert their dominance. The winter months added another layer of complexity to these power struggles. During the coldest months, when the streets were empty and the days were short, the gangs would operate under the cover of darkness, making it harder for law enforcement to track their movements. The snow-covered streets became a cloak for criminal activities, as the mafia's covert operations, whether smuggling, assassination, or extortion, went largely unnoticed by the general public. It was during these months that many of the most violent clashes took place, as rival factions fought for control over turf, all while the city lay still under a blanket of snow. In these violent times, it became clear that the control of Moscow and St. Petersburg wasn't just about wealth, it was about survival. The mafia's hold on the cities became unshakable as they consolidated their power through violence, corruption, and fear. As the stakes rose and the death toll mounted, the streets became battlefields, with the Russian Mafia entrenched in a brutal war for dominance, with no end in sight. For those involved, the price of failure was high. Not only the loss of wealth and power, but often their lives. The winners in this battle would not only control the cities, they would shape the future of post-Soviet Russia itself. In the cutthroat world of the Russian Mafia, violence wasn't just a tool, it was often the only language understood. Criminal gangs employed a variety of ruthless tactics to maintain control, ensuring that rivals stayed in line and that their territory remained secure. As you imagine the brutal world of Russian organized crime, picture the relentless and chilling methods used to exert dominance. The primary tactic was intimidation. As the stakes rose and the death toll mounted, the streets became battlefields, with the Russian Mafia entrenched in a brutal war for dominance, with no end in sight. For those involved, the price of failure was high. Not only the loss of wealth and power, but often their lives. The winners in this battle would not only control the cities, they would shape the future of post-Soviet Russia itself. During the coldest months, when the streets were empty and the days were short, the gangs would operate under the cover of darkness, making it harder for law enforcement to track their movements. The snow-covered streets became a cloak for criminal activities, as the mafia's covert operations, whether smuggling, assassination, or extortion, went largely unnoticed by the general public. The intertwining of politics, business, and crime created a perfect storm, allowing the Russian Mafia to flourish unchecked, even in the face of rising violence. In some instances, gangs even brokered temporary alliances to neutralize a common threat, such as a rival gang or an overzealous law enforcement officer. These tactical alliances were based purely on self-interest, with the gangs pooling their resources to take down a shared adversary. Mafia groups often relied on fear to maintain power, using threats of violence or actual physical harm to deter challengers. Kidnappings, bombings, and targeted killings were common, especially when gangs wanted to send a message or eliminate a rival. The violence was not just about inflicting damage, it was about instilling terror in the hearts of business owners, citizens, and even law enforcement. Cooperation with corrupt officials was another key tactic. Mafia groups often relied on fear to maintain power, using threats of violence or actual physical harm to deter challengers. Kidnappings, bombings, and targeted killings were common, especially when gangs wanted to send a message or eliminate a rival. The violence was not just about inflicting damage, it was about instilling terror in the hearts of business owners, citizens, and even law enforcement. Cooperation with corrupt officials was another key tactic. Fewer people on the streets meant that law enforcement could be easily overwhelmed or distracted by the chaos of the winter weather, giving criminal groups an advantage. Rival gangs often took advantage of the stillness of the snowy streets, carrying out ambushes or settling scores in relative silence. These winter battles were not just about territory, they were about asserting dominance in an environment where the stakes were higher and the risks of failure were greater. During the winter, mafia groups often conducted their intimidation and violence behind closed doors, away from prying eyes. In the isolated districts of these cities, hidden away from the public's view, mafia bosses would hold meetings to plan attacks or strikes against rival gangs. The long winter nights meant more time to conduct clandestine operations, including arranging hits or extorting business owners who were struggling to survive the cold. Once the threat was eliminated, however, these alliances would quickly dissolve as the gangs returned to their own battles for control. Imagine the frigid Russian winter closing in on Moscow or St. Petersburg. The icy winds sweep through the streets, snow falls in thick sheets, and the night lasts for hours. In such conditions, the power struggles between criminal gangs took on a different dynamic. Survival became a priority, and the mafia, with its control over essential resources like heating, fuel, or food, was seen as a necessary evil. In many cases, local businesses turned to the mafia for protection against the brutal conditions and even the threat of rival gangs. The mafia took advantage of the vulnerability created by the winter to extend their reach even further into every facet of life. In the absence of a functioning state, criminal organizations capitalized on the situation, offering protection from the harsh winter conditions in exchange for loyalty, money, or other forms of compliance. Local businesses that were struggling to keep their doors open during the cold months often had little choice but to pay the mafia for protection from rival gangs, robbery, or even local authorities who were either corrupt or overwhelmed by the chaos of the season. In the absence of a functioning state, criminal organizations capitalized on the situation, offering protection from the harsh winter conditions in exchange for loyalty, money, or other forms of compliance. Local businesses that were struggling to keep their doors open during the cold months often had little choice but to pay the mafia for protection from rival gangs, robbery, or even local authorities who were either corrupt or overwhelmed by the chaos of the season. The mafia's ability to operate in these harsh conditions further solidified their control over key territories, even as the rest of the city seemed frozen in time. The cold also played a psychological role. For those already struggling with the brutal conditions of the winter, the mafia's presence became even more pervasive. People were more likely to comply with the demands of a criminal organization when they were already battling the harsh elements. The mafia's ability to operate in these harsh conditions further solidified their control over key territories, even as the rest of the city seemed frozen in time. The cold also played a psychological role. For those already struggling with the brutal conditions of the winter, the mafia's presence became even more pervasive. People were more likely to comply with the demands of a criminal organization when they were already battling the harsh elements. In the isolated corners of the cities, where people had no choice but to rely on the mafia for survival, the psychological impact of the winter months was evident. The cold, combined with the mafia's pervasive influence, created an environment of fear and submission. People who were already struggling to survive the brutal conditions were further weakened by the looming threat of violence or the loss of access to vital resources. The mafia's presence was not just a matter of criminal control, it was about survival. The winter months also allowed the mafia to tighten their grip on the political landscape. In a country where corruption ran deep, local politicians were often forced to make deals with criminal organizations to maintain control over their districts. The mafia's ability to operate in these harsh conditions further solidified their control over key territories, even as the rest of the city seemed frozen in time. The cold also played a psychological role. For those already struggling with the brutal conditions of the winter, the mafia's presence became even more pervasive. People were more likely to comply with the demands of a criminal organization when they were already battling the harsh elements. The snow-covered roads became part of the mafia's carefully calculated plan to expand their reach, smuggling goods across the country and beyond, undeterred by the typical barriers that would have hampered legitimate trade. As the mafia's power grew during these cold months, their ability to manipulate the environment and people's vulnerability became their greatest strength. These targeted attacks were not just about eliminating rivals, but also sending a clear message to anyone who might consider standing in the mafia's way. Resistance would be crushed, and the price of defiance was often death. While most people were trying to stay alive, simply surviving the cold, the Russian Mafia thrived, turning the bleakness of winter into a season of opportunity. As the bitter cold took hold of the cities, the Russian Mafia also expanded its influence over essential services such as heating, electricity, and food distribution. The freezing temperatures created an atmosphere of desperation, and many residents found themselves dependent on the mafia to survive. The snow, the isolation, and the long nights gave them the cover they needed to expand their power, making the winter months a time of increased influence. As the rest of the country struggled with the practical realities of survival, the mafia was consolidating its dominance, both through brute force and strategic alliances, with no one daring to challenge their authority. Winter also allowed the mafia to increase their control over transportation networks, which were often disrupted by the weather. While the average citizen could not easily travel due to blocked roads or canceled flights, the Mafia used their influence to ensure that critical shipments, whether they were illegal goods or protection money, still moved smoothly. They operated in secret, using modified vehicles equipped to navigate treacherous conditions. As the Mafia extended its influence during these harsh months, their ability to strike fear into the hearts of the population became more pronounced. Those who opposed them were often met with sudden, violent retribution. Assassinations or bombings were carried out with impunity, using the cover of winter's silence to avoid detection. The long winter nights allowed for careful planning and execution, often without the risk of immediate consequences. In the absence of a functioning state, criminal organizations capitalized on the situation, offering protection from the harsh winter conditions in exchange for loyalty, money, or other forms of compliance. Local businesses that were struggling to keep their doors open during the cold months often had little choice but to pay the Mafia for protection from rival gangs, robbery, or even local authorities who were either corrupt or overwhelmed by the chaos of the season. Businesses that offered vital services like heating or food often fell under the Mafia's control, either through intimidation or force. In a society where many were just trying to survive the freezing temperatures, these resources became a key point of leverage for the criminal organizations. The Mafia offered their services in exchange for control, using the scarcity of resources as a tool to expand their influence. They didn't just survive the winter, they thrived in it, using it as a shield to hide their operations and a weapon to further their control. The brutal conditions that most people saw as a struggle for survival became, for the Mafia, just another means to reinforce their dominance and expand their influence over every aspect of life. The cold didn't freeze them, it hardened them, turning the harsh Russian winter into an integral part of their rise to power. The Mafia's ability to control resources in these conditions reinforced their dominance, allowing them to dictate terms even when the streets were buried under feet of snow. As you picture the harsh Russian winter enveloping the streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg, you begin to realize how the criminal underworld adapted to the challenges posed by the cold. While most people were confined to their homes, avoiding the biting winds and heavy snowfall, criminal gangs like the Russian Mafia found ways to thrive. The winter months, with their isolation and harsh conditions, created the perfect environment for covert operations to unfold without detection. The Mafia, ever resourceful, took full advantage of the winter's stillness. With fewer people on the streets and law enforcement stretched thin due to the cold, the gang's activities could unfold quietly and with little resistance. Whether it was a smuggling operation or contract killings, the cover of winter provided the ideal conditions to execute these criminal acts without the usual risk of being caught. The empty streets, muffled by snow, allowed criminals to carry out their activities in secrecy, from illicit exchanges in dark alleys to settling scores between rival factions. The long winter nights, with their extended periods of darkness, allowed criminal gangs to operate for longer hours, making it easier to plan and execute operations under the radar. The Mafia's ability to operate covertly was enhanced by the harsh weather conditions, which discouraged civilians from wandering the streets and made it harder for law enforcement to conduct patrols. This created a window of opportunity for secretive and often violent operations to unfold without the fear of immediate intervention. The isolation of winter not only provided a physical cover for the mafia's illegal activities, but it also created a sense of psychological isolation that worked in their favor. As the harsh, cold, and long nights limited people's ability to socialize, the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg became eerily empty, further reducing the chances of civilians stumbling upon criminal activities. The lack of public activity gave the mafia free rein to carry out their operations without fear of prying eyes or spontaneous witnesses. In these conditions, the mafia was able to execute contract killings with greater efficiency and less risk of detection. The snow-covered streets became the perfect backdrop for silent assassinations, where the absence of traffic and pedestrians made it easy for a hitman to blend into the environment. Whether they used firearms or knives, the extreme winter conditions allowed these operations to go unnoticed. Gunshots, usually loud and attention-grabbing in the quiet of a city, were muffled by the thick blanket of snow, further reducing the chances of being detected by nearby residents or law enforcement. Moreover, the cover of darkness during the winter months was a key element in the mafia's ability to operate unnoticed. With the sun setting early in the afternoon and the days remaining dark for hours, there was ample time for covert operations to unfold without being interrupted by daylight. Criminal gangs capitalized on the extended night hours, knowing that they had several hours to complete illicit deals, exchange goods, or settle rivalries without the risk of being observed. The darkness provided the perfect camouflage, allowing criminals to work freely while the rest of the city was locked inside, hiding from the brutal weather. The mafia also adapted by operating in remote areas of the city or outskirts, where law enforcement presence was minimal. During the winter months, these areas became even more isolated, with snowdrifts blocking roads and making travel difficult. In these less frequented neighborhoods, the mafia could conduct their business undisturbed. Whether it was smuggling contraband, trafficking weapons, or enforcing protection rackets, the winter's harsh conditions made it more difficult for authorities to track or respond quickly to criminal activities. The mafia, knowing this, took full advantage of the long, desolate winter nights to expand their reach into these quieter, more vulnerable areas. While the cold created an environment of isolation and silence, it also worked as a psychological tool for the mafia. With the streets largely deserted and the city seemingly at a standstill, the mafia's presence was felt more intensely by both the public and rival gangs. People, already weakened by the harsh conditions, were more likely to comply with demands for protection, money, or extortion during the winter months, as survival became their #1 priority. With fewer people on the streets, those who were left were more susceptible to intimidation and threats, especially when their ability to turn to law enforcement for help was limited. The cold also played a role in the mafia's ability to manipulate business owners. As shops and small businesses struggled to stay open during the winter, many found themselves at the mercy of criminal groups offering protection. For small business owners, keeping their stores safe from theft, damage, or other criminal activity often meant paying the mafia for their protection services. The mafia's influence over these businesses was amplified by the harsh winter conditions which made survival harder. The threat of being left to face the dangers of the season alone, without the mafia's so-called protection, pushed many to comply with their demands. In the frigid months, the mafia's control over essential services also grew stronger. With resources like heating, food, and fuel in high demand, the criminal organizations took advantage of these shortages to assert their dominance. Mafia groups monopolized fuel distribution, heating oil, and even basic food supplies in certain neighborhoods, using the cold as leverage to secure higher profits and further extend their influence. In some areas, mafia groups controlled the very means of survival, ensuring that businesses and individuals remained dependent on them for protection against the elements. In this environment, the psychological pressure on the population was immense. People already dealing with the harsh conditions of winter were now faced with the threat of mafia retaliation for failing to pay protection money or for attempting to resist their control. The constant presence of criminal groups made it clear to many that the mafia held more power than the state, with the cold weather further emphasizing their ability to dominate in times of crisis. The combination of physical isolation, covert operations, and psychological pressure made the Russian winter the perfect environment for the mafia to carry out its criminal activities. The cold, long nights offered a safe cover for all sorts of illicit actions, from smuggling to violence, and the general population's vulnerability increased the mafia's grip on power. For the mafia, winter wasn't just a challenge, it was an opportunity to grow stronger and more entrenched, using the harshest conditions of the year to further cement their dominance in Russian society. The Russian mafia's involvement in smuggling and drug trafficking was perhaps one of the most lucrative aspects of their operations, and winter conditions only added a layer of complexity to their methods. Smuggling routes that were once used for everyday trade were now being repurposed for illegal activities, as mafia groups sought to expand their power and wealth. The cold weather did present challenges, particularly in terms of transportation, but it also provided strategic advantages that the mafia quickly learned to exploit. One of the major challenges posed by the winter was transportation. While snow and ice made roads impassable for most people, the Russian mafia's operations were not bound by the same limitations. They had access to modified vehicles equipped to handle the icy terrain, such as snowmobiles and four-wheel drive trucks. These vehicles allowed them to navigate rural, snow-covered roads where the police or other authorities were less likely to patrol. With the roads less crowded and the cold driving people indoors, the mafia could move shipments of drugs, weapons, and other illicit goods undetected, often using isolated routes that were difficult to access by law enforcement. Drug trafficking, in particular, became a highly profitable enterprise for the Russian mafia in the post-Soviet period. The collapse of the Soviet Union had resulted in the breakdown of many state-run supply chains, leaving a vacuum that the mafia quickly filled. Smuggling routes, including those that ran from Central Asia into Russia and across the border into Europe, became central to their operations. Despite the harsh winter weather, the mafia utilized the cover of snow-covered landscapes to transport heroin, cocaine, and other illicit drugs across Russia and beyond. These routes were often hidden from the prying eyes of law enforcement, who were overwhelmed by the chaos of winter conditions. Additionally, the winter months allowed the mafia to conceal shipments more effectively. The snow acted as a natural cover, making it easier for criminal groups to hide their goods during transport. Weapons, narcotics, and other contraband could be hidden beneath blankets of snow, inside seemingly legitimate shipments, or buried in hidden bunkers until it was safe to move them. The ability to conceal their operations particularly in the more rural or remote areas, made the mafia's smuggling and drug trafficking activities particularly difficult to track or disrupt. While many businesses in Russia struggled to survive during the harsh winter, the Russian mafia continued its criminal dealings, undeterred by the cold. In fact, the extreme conditions of winter often worked in the mafia's favor, providing opportunities for them to tighten their grip on various sectors of the economy. From protection rackets to arms trading, the mafia maintained their operations with the same ruthless efficiency, using the isolation and desperation brought on by the cold to further expand their power. In the colder months, the protection racket became an even more effective means of control. Small business owners, already struggling to stay afloat during the winter, found themselves increasingly dependent on the mafia to shield them from the harsher realities of life. With fewer customers on the streets and a higher risk of being targeted by other criminals or extorted by rival gangs, these businesses were more likely to comply with the mafia's demands. Protection money, which had always been a significant part of mafia operations, became more widespread during the winter, as businesses sought the mafia's assistance to survive the season. Similarly, the arms trade continued as a crucial source of income for the Russian mafia during the winter months. While many sectors of the economy slowed down, the demand for illegal arms did not. With the disintegration of the Soviet Union, millions of weapons were suddenly available on the black market, and the mafia seized the opportunity to take control of this lucrative trade. While official arms deals were often slowed by the weather, the mafia adapted by operating in secret, moving arms shipments under the cover of darkness and snow. The illegal arms trade became particularly profitable as various regional conflicts emerged in the post-Soviet era. The Russian Mafia, with its well-established networks and access to weapons, supplied arms to different factions, both within Russia and in other conflict zones. In some instances, the Mafia worked with political leaders or military officials to broker arms deals, further cementing their control over the trade and furthering their ability to influence the political landscape. Despite the extreme cold, the Mafia's operations in money laundering and financial crimes continued uninterrupted during the winter. With the post-Soviet economy transitioning to a market system, there were numerous opportunities for the Mafia to launder illicit profits and infiltrate legitimate businesses. As Russian businesses became increasingly privatized, the Mafia used its growing influence to buy shares, gain control of state-owned enterprises, and clean its criminal earnings through these newly privatized sectors. The absence of a robust legal framework and the prevalence of corruption allowed the Mafia to exploit weaknesses in the system. The cold, isolated conditions during the winter months made it easier for criminal organizations to move money, set up shell companies, and engage in financial schemes without attracting attention. The snow and frozen roads of Russia provided a quiet cover for these dealings, as the Mafia quietly moved illicit funds, sometimes using international financial systems to launder money beyond Russia's borders. With the cold months giving the Mafia more time to plan and execute financial operations, they solidified their position in both the Russian and global economies. Their ability to launder money, avoid detection, and expand their influence made them an enduring force, even as the rest of the economy slowed down during the winter months. During the winter months, the Russian Mafia's influence over the economy grew ever more entrenched, as the cold provided them with both cover and time to plan. The lack of oversight in the financial sector, coupled with the state's weakened capacity to regulate the economy, created a perfect storm for criminal organizations to thrive. The Mafia took full advantage of the privatization efforts following the collapse of the Soviet Union, where state-owned companies were sold off at a fraction of their true value. Through a combination of coercion, bribery, and violent intimidation, the Mafia gained control of many of these newly privatized assets, turning them into valuable front companies for money laundering operations. While the world outside struggled against the harsh winter, the Mafia's operations in the financial sector remained in full swing. They infiltrated banks, construction firms, and energy companies, laundering money from illicit activities through these legitimate business channels. Many of these businesses were little more than shells companies with few real assets or operations, yet they provided a perfect facade for moving illicit funds. These front companies allowed the Mafia to clean their dirty money, disguising the true origin of their profits and integrating them into the formal economy. Shell companies were a particularly useful tool during the winter months, as the cold weather often led to slower activity in the economy, giving the Mafia time to work their financial schemes without attracting attention. These companies could be set up quickly, often with little more than paperwork and connections to corrupt officials or bankers. They allowed the Mafia to launder money domestically through Russia's still developing banking system and internationally by funneling funds into Western financial institutions. The snow and isolation of winter allowed these financial operations to be carried out in relative secrecy, as fewer people were out on the streets, and law enforcement was often distracted by the everyday challenges posed by the season's brutality. As the global economy began to open up, the Russian Mafia's reach extended further. International trade increased, and with it, the Mafia's ability to use global financial networks to launder money. The winter months allowed them to transfer funds and establish accounts in foreign banks, moving illicit money across borders without attracting as much scrutiny. The cold conditions made it harder for law enforcement and regulatory bodies to track these complex transactions, which often involved multiple layers of shell companies, offshore accounts, and anonymous transactions. The Mafia used these tools to invest in legitimate markets, including real estate and stocks, further integrating their illegal profits into the global economy. The Mafia also used their financial power to influence the political landscape. Through the strategic placement of bribes and kickbacks, they managed to ensure that their business interests were protected, even as the government grappled with corruption and instability. Politicians, bankers, and business leaders were often complicit in these schemes, allowing the Mafia to operate with relative impunity. The winter months, with their slower pace and isolation, made it easier for these deals to take place behind closed doors, away from the public eye and the scrutiny of law enforcement. By maintaining control over critical industries, such as oil, gas, and metals, the Russian Mafia ensured that they had a consistent flow of money to launder. The ability to integrate illicit profits into these legitimate industries helped them grow their power, both in Russia and abroad. As the Mafia solidified its control over these markets, it became clear that their grip on the economy was no longer limited to illegal activities alone. It extended to the very foundation of the Russian economy itself. The financial crimes of the Mafia in the winter months were not just about laundering money, they were about expanding their empire. The cold gave them the opportunity to plan scheme, and move their illicit funds without interference. As the Russian economy continued its tumultuous transition from a Soviet-style economy to a market-based one, the Mafia was already well placed to take advantage of the system's weaknesses. Their ability to operate in the shadows of the winter months allowed them to build a vast network of financial power that would continue to influence Russia's economy for decades to come. With their ability to adapt and capitalize on the challenges of winter, the Russian Mafia's financial operations remained as strong as ever. They continued to build their wealth and power, using the cold months to expand their influence and solidify their place in both the Russian and global economies. The winter, which might have frozen many sectors of the economy, became a time for the Mafia to thrive, as they found new ways to launder money, acquire assets, and increase their control over both the criminal and legitimate worlds. As you envision the cold, snow-covered streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg, it's important to understand that the Russian Mafia's power was not just limited to criminal enterprises. It extended deep into the corridors of political power. The harsh winter months, with their long, dark nights and isolation, allowed the Mafia to solidify its relationships with political figures, often in the shadows where decisions were made away from public scrutiny. During the 1992 and early 2000s, as Russia transitioned from a centralized Soviet economy to a free market system, corruption was rampant. The government was struggling to establish control over the country's vast and fractured landscape, and many politicians, particularly in local and regional governments, were either powerless or willing to make deals with criminal organizations. The Mafia, with its growing wealth and influence, saw an opportunity to exert control over both the economy and the political system. As the cold of winter gripped the cities, these deals were often made behind closed doors, out of sight from the public eye. Political corruption was rampant during this time, and the Mafia knew exactly how to exploit it. They provided financial backing to politicians in exchange for favorable treatment or protection of their operations. In return for their support, the Mafia often ensured that their illegal businesses, whether they were involved in smuggling, extortion, or drug trafficking, could continue without interference from the authorities. The winter months, with their isolated atmosphere, made these illicit meetings and exchanges easier to conduct away from prying eyes. Mafia leaders would meet with corrupt politicians, businessmen, and even law enforcement officials in secret, solidifying their influence over critical political decisions and government contracts. These ties between the Mafia and political figures weren't just about protecting business interests. They also played a key role in influencing policy decisions that allowed the criminal organizations to operate unchecked. In return for their cooperation, the Mafia ensured the protection of certain sectors, such as oil, gas, construction, and retail. As the Mafia gained more political allies, their power and influence grew, allowing them to exert control over entire industries and regions. The cold, harsh winter months only enhanced the Mafia's ability to do so covertly, as fewer people were on the streets to witness such deals, and the long nights provided ample time for these meetings and transactions. The economic impact of the Russian Mafia's influence, especially during the winter months, was far-reaching, particularly in the country's illicit sectors. As businesses slowed down or shut their doors due to the extreme cold, the Mafia filled the void. They not only operated in the black market but also began to control large swaths of the legitimate economy. During winter, when many businesses struggled to make profits, the mafia seized opportunities to dominate key industries. For example, protection rackets were particularly effective in the winter months when many small businesses were vulnerable to theft, loss of revenue, or extortion. The mafia capitalized on this by offering protection to these businesses, knowing that the owners had little choice but to comply. The cold weather, which made travel difficult and kept people indoors, made it easier for the mafia to intimidate and control local businesses. For example, protection rackets were particularly effective in the winter months when many small businesses were vulnerable to theft, loss of revenue, or extortion. The mafia capitalized on this by offering protection to these businesses, knowing that the owners had little choice but to comply. The cold weather, which made travel difficult and kept people indoors, made it easier for the mafia to intimidate and control local businesses. With the public in desperate need of warmth and sustenance during the harsh winter months, the mafia was able to monopolize these sectors, ensuring that businesses and individuals were dependent on them. Through manipulation and coercion, they took control of essential goods, further embedding themselves in the economy. People had no choice but to pay the mafia for the resources they needed to survive, reinforcing the mafia's position as a central figure in the Russian economy, even during the most difficult months. In addition to extortion and smuggling, the mafia also expanded into money laundering, using the winter months to quietly clean their illicit profits through various financial schemes. With the country's financial institutions still underdeveloped and corruption running rampant, the mafia used their influence to infiltrate the banking sector. They laundered money from illegal activities by funneling it through legitimate businesses and investments, further integrating their criminal earnings into the fabric of the Russian economy. This was all done under the radar, using the isolation of the winter months to avoid detection by authorities. By extorting construction companies for protection or even taking over specific contracts, they gained control over both the supply chain and labor force. The mafia often supplied substandard materials at inflated prices or took over entire building sites to sell them off for a profit, further exploiting the weakness in the market. The winter's quieter nature made it easier to infiltrate these sectors, with fewer eyes to notice the illicit practices that took place behind the scenes. While many businesses were struggling or closed for the season, the mafia's operations were relentless, taking full advantage of the situation. One of the sectors that saw significant mafia expansion during the winter was construction. With many legitimate construction projects slowed down due to the freezing temperatures, the mafia saw an opportunity to corner the market. They knew that people were already struggling to survive the winter, and the fear of being targeted by rival gangs or criminals made it more likely that business owners would turn to the mafia for assistance, even if it meant paying a significant portion of their income in exchange for protection. Moreover, the control over vital resources like heating fuel, coal, and food distribution allowed the mafia to expand their influence. The mafia's control over the construction industry was part of a broader strategy to dominate essential services and sectors, including transportation and energy. In the dead of winter, transportation networks were essential, as goods and services, including fuel, had to be moved across the country. The mafia took advantage of the logistical challenges posed by snow and ice to control key routes and distribution networks. By intimidating or bribing those in charge of transportation, the mafia made sure that their businesses were the first to be served, squeezing out competition and establishing monopolies over crucial services. In particular, the distribution of heating, fuel, and coal became a lucrative industry under mafia control. As the demand for warmth skyrocketed, the mafia monopolized the supply, forcing businesses and households to depend on their illegal operations. Those who couldn't pay or comply faced violent retribution, a tactic that ensured the mafia's dominance over the winter economy. In addition to extortion, the mafia expanded their operations in the financial sector. Money laundering, a core part of the Russian mafia's economic activity, flourished during the winter months. The financial systems of post-Soviet Russia were still in disarray, and corruption was rampant at every level. With little regulation and even less enforcement, the mafia saw an opening to launder their illicit profits through illegal businesses, shell companies, and even foreign bank accounts. They used these methods to integrate their dirty money into the broader economy, often investing in real estate, stocks, or privatized companies. The lack of transparency in financial markets meant that the mafia could operate quietly under the radar, moving vast sums of money across borders without drawing attention. The isolation brought by the cold weather made it easier for the mafia to coordinate these schemes in relative secrecy, allowing them to clean their earnings without interference from the authorities. Moreover, the winter months also gave the mafia the perfect opportunity to expand their reach internationally. While many countries were distracted by their own internal problems and cold weather, the mafia used the time to organize cross-border operations. The Russian Mafia forged stronger ties with criminal groups in Europe, the United States, and beyond, moving goods like drugs, weapons, and even human trafficking victims across borders. Smuggling routes were established through remote and isolated regions during the winter, taking advantage of the freezing conditions to move illicit shipments undetected. The mafia's influence on the global criminal network grew stronger during the cold months, as they used their strategic advantage to infiltrate more international markets, making the Russian Mafia one of the most formidable criminal syndicates worldwide. By the time the cold finally thawed, the Russian Mafia had solidified its position not only as a key player in Russia's economy, but also as a global force in organized crime. The cold, isolation, and lack of oversight allowed them to expand their operations in every direction, infiltrating both illicit and legitimate markets. They maintained their grip over essential services, used financial networks to launder money, and extended their reach beyond Russia's borders, ensuring that the criminal enterprise continued to grow, even as the rest of the economy remained sluggish during the winter months. In the end, the winter months became a season of power consolidation for the Russian Mafia. The challenges posed by the cold only sharpened their tactics, allowing them to move more covertly, expand their control over vital resources, and grow their wealth without interference. As the snow melted and the days grew longer, the mafia's influence was firmly entrenched in both Russia and the global criminal economy, an enduring force that had adapted to every challenge winter threw its way. People had no choice but to pay the mafia for the resources they needed to survive, reinforcing the mafia's position as a central figure in the Russian economy, even during the most difficult months. In addition to extortion and smuggling, the mafia also expanded into money laundering, using the winter months to quietly clean their illicit profits through various financial schemes. The Russian Mafia, always adapting to new opportunities, expanded its operations into global drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and human trafficking. During the winter months, when law enforcement was often bogged down by weather-related issues, the Mafia could organize and carry out cross-border operations without attracting attention. Trafficking routes that ran through Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and even into the Middle East became key focal points for the Mafia's global reach. The cold and isolation of the Russian winter made it easier for the Mafia to move illegal goods through remote, less monitored routes, using backdoor deals and corrupt officials to avoid detection. The Mafia also expanded into Western markets, using the financial systems of the US and Europe to launder their illicit earnings. The long, cold winters allowed the Mafia to set up front companies, transfer illicit money across borders, and establish ties with foreign criminal networks. In doing so, they solidified their status as one of the most powerful and globalized criminal organizations in the world. By the time the thaw came, the Russian Mafia was already deeply entrenched in international crime, using snow-covered routes to smuggle drugs and weapons across Europe and beyond, often with the help of their global criminal connections. Whether in the heart of Russia or in the streets of New York, the Russian Mafia's influence was felt far and wide, all while operating in the shadows during the quiet months of winter. As you imagine the long, dark winter months, when the cold slows down daily life and isolates entire regions, it's clear how this season played a key role in the Russian Mafia's ability to operate internationally. While legitimate businesses slowed, the Mafia seized the opportunity to expand their global network. The quiet isolation of winter was not just a time for local operations, it was a chance for them to forge new alliances, solidify old ones, and execute operations that would have been difficult during more active seasons. Trafficking operations across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and into the Middle East were central to the Mafia's ability to dominate international criminal markets. The Mafia used remote routes, often avoiding major highways and borders, which were less monitored during the winter months. Snowstorms and ice-covered roads created natural barriers that helped criminals cover their tracks, making it harder for law enforcement to keep up with their movements. These backdoor routes allowed them to smuggle heroin, cocaine, weapons, and stolen goods, circumventing traditional checkpoints. Additionally, the corrupt officials, who were often paid off by the Mafia, played a key role in facilitating these clandestine operations, ensuring that goods moved across borders with little resistance. As cross-border smuggling became easier, the Mafia extended their operations into the arms trade, providing weapons to conflict zones across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. During the cold months, when transportation routes became more challenging for most, the Russian Mafia had the infrastructure to continue moving illicit weapons efficiently. They often worked with other international criminal groups, creating an interconnected web of illegal activity that spanned continents. The snow and isolation that marked Russia's winter made the logistical challenges of transporting weapons and drugs seem less daunting. Mafia groups used this time to strengthen ties with arms dealers, military contractors, and corrupt officials who could help them continue operating without interference. The winter months also saw the Mafia's expansion into human trafficking, as vulnerable individuals from former Soviet states and Eastern Europe were increasingly targeted for exploitation. The desperation brought on by the brutal cold and economic instability made it easier for traffickers to prey on those seeking better opportunities. The Russian Mafia, with its extensive network, facilitated this illicit trade, moving people across borders to be exploited for forced labor or prostitution. The isolation of winter made these trafficking routes more difficult to trace, and the Mafia capitalized on this, smuggling victims through less patrolled areas and exploiting the disrupted economies of the regions. The winter months provided the Russian Mafia with a strategic advantage in organizing and executing cross-border operations. The cold conditions and limited visibility allowed them to carry out illicit transactions and smuggling operations in ways that would have been impossible during warmer months when borders and customs were more heavily patrolled. The psychological advantage of winter was also key. The Mafia knew that governments and law enforcement were often less vigilant during the colder months. With fewer people on the streets, the Mafia had more room to move and organize their illegal operations without attracting attention. They could operate in remote regions, establishing new trade routes for drugs, weapons, and stolen goods. During the long, dark winter nights, these operations were covert, moving across borders, shipping illicit goods, and laundering vast sums of money without being detected. Winter, with its muffled, quiet, and isolated atmosphere, became the perfect cover for secretive, transnational operations. While the rest of the world slowed down during the coldest months, the Russian Mafia was thriving, expanding, and consolidating their power both within Russia and on the global stage. For them, the winter was not a time of stagnation. It was a time to grow stronger, widen their network, and increase their influence across borders. As the cold of winter enveloped Russia and its neighboring regions, the Russian Mafia's ability to operate undisturbed only grew. With fewer patrols and less scrutiny from authorities, the Mafia was free to execute transnational operations that extended far beyond the borders of Russia. The psychological advantage that winter provided was invaluable. While citizens were preoccupied with surviving the harsh conditions, the Mafia used the season to further embed itself into the global criminal network, with remote and isolated routes becoming easier to navigate during the winter. The Mafia could establish new smuggling corridors, often moving goods between countries where law enforcement was either understaffed or distracted by winter weather disruptions. The Mafia's logistical expertise allowed them to thrive in this environment, where fewer people were on the move and borders were less guarded. Illicit goods, such as narcotics, weapons, and stolen merchandise, could be transported across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and even into Western Europe and the United States, all while the world's attention was diverted by snowstorms and freezing temperatures. In addition to smuggling, the winter months provided a perfect cover for other covert operations, such as money laundering and weapons dealing. The Mafia capitalized on corrupt international financial systems during this time, moving large sums of dirty money across borders. Banks were slower to process transactions during the holidays and the cold winter months, giving the Mafia more time to launder illicit profits through complex channels without drawing attention. The financial systems in the U.S., Europe, and Asia, which were often overwhelmed by the seasonal shift, allowed the Mafia to funnel these proceeds into legitimate businesses, further integrating their criminal earnings into the global economy. As the Mafia's smuggling routes expanded, they became more deeply connected with other international criminal organizations. With the winter months offering the cover of isolation, these connections grew stronger, as criminal groups around the world traded resources, criminal expertise, and access to illicit markets. The Russian Mafia established alliances with groups from Central America, Asia, and Western Europe, solidifying their position as a dominant force in global organized crime. These alliances allowed them to operate smoothly, even in foreign territories where they had no direct presence. Additionally, the long winter nights, which seemed to stretch endlessly in the Russian countryside, provided the Mafia with ample time to plan and execute their operations without interruption. With limited daylight and cold weather conditions keeping the public indoors, the Mafia could carry out highly organized heists, bank robberies, and even targeted assassinations of rivals without fear of detection. The isolation of winter only added to the fear that the Mafia instilled in the public, knowing that the colder months were when criminal groups made their most aggressive moves, cementing their hold on both the streets and international networks. The international influence of the Russian Mafia grew exponentially during this period, and winter became their season of expansion. While the rest of the world hunkered down, trying to endure the season, the Mafia capitalized on the low-profile conditions to move illegal goods, clean dirty money, and tighten their grip on global markets, whether it was through drug trade, weapon smuggling, or the trafficking of human beings. The Mafia used the winter months to expand their criminal empire and solidify their presence in countries around the world. As the months passed, the Mafia's transnational operations became more sophisticated, aided by the cover provided by winter's isolation. Smuggling shipments were coordinated with international syndicates, and strategic investments in legitimate businesses were executed without suspicion. As the months passed, the Mafia's transnational operations became more sophisticated, aided by the cover provided by winter's isolation. Smuggling shipments were coordinated with international syndicates, and strategic investments in legitimate businesses were executed without suspicion. While families struggled to stay warm and business owners tried to survive the economic fallout of the cold season, the Mafia used the vulnerability of winter to exploit weaknesses and assert dominance. The Mafia wasn't just operating in the shadows, they were expanding in plain sight, quietly reinforcing their power over both the criminal and legitimate sectors of the economy. For the Russian Mafia, winter was more than a mere season of cold. It was a strategic advantage that enabled them to thrive, expand, and reinforce their control over criminal networks across the globe. The ice-covered streets, the long nights, and the isolation of winter worked as a cover for their most successful operations, propelling them into an era of international prominence that would continue to shape their legacy for years to come. As the Russian Mafia's influence spread across the globe, the winter months continued to serve as a vital time for strategic planning and expansion. The isolated conditions of winter not only gave the Mafia space to conduct their clandestine operations, but also created new opportunities for controlling critical resources. The bitter cold, while it posed challenges for many industries, was an opportunity for criminal organizations to gain further ground in sectors that were essential to survival. In Russia, the Mafia's control over energy resources like heating, fuel, gas, and electricity became more pronounced. With much of the population dependent on these resources to survive the cold months, the Mafia leveraged their power over fuel suppliers, extorting businesses and households for payment in exchange for continued access to essential utilities. For many, There was no choice but to comply with the mafia's demands, as the threat of cutting off access to heat during the harshest part of the year meant certain financial ruin or even death. This practice further entrenched the mafia's dominance in critical sectors, turning essential services into tools of power and control. Winter also allowed the mafia to extend their reach into the political realm, using the quiet months to broker deals and solidify ties with corrupt politicians and business leaders who were less active due to the weather. As the Russian Mafia's influence spread across the globe, the winter months continued to serve as a vital time for strategic planning and expansion. The isolated conditions of winter not only gave the mafia space to conduct their clandestine operations, but also created new opportunities for controlling critical resources. The disruptions caused by the snow and freezing temperatures often rendered the government ineffective, creating a perfect window for criminal groups to manipulate and infiltrate political structures. Politicians and officials, eager to avoid the public's ire during the winter months when their approval ratings were low, were more likely to turn to the mafia for protection or financial backing. The international reach of the Russian Mafia, further facilitated by the winter months, became increasingly sophisticated as well. Mafia groups, already well established in places like Germany, Spain, and Italy, began to expand into new markets across the Middle East, Asia, and North America. By strategically using winter trade routes, particularly in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the mafia was able to move illicit goods across borders, taking advantage of lower vigilance by customs and border security personnel during the cold season. For example, smuggling networks that stretched from Central Asia into Russia and from there into Western Europe were restructured to move goods more efficiently during the colder months. The backlog of customs inspections caused by snowstorms or the lack of personnel allowed the mafia to quietly push contraband drugs, weapons, counterfeit goods across borders without detection. The complexity of the routes they operated also involved covert partnerships with other criminal organizations, ensuring that once the goods crossed one border, they could be quickly transferred to the next, avoiding scrutiny. This expansion wasn't limited to illegal goods. As the financial crisis gripped post-Soviet Russia, the mafia used their increasing international presence to infiltrate international markets. They made connections with other criminal syndicates in Europe, Asia, and the United States, creating joint ventures in illicit trade. The winter months, when global shipping slowed and people were less active, were the perfect time to organize these international criminal networks in a way that would allow them to move undetected in the future. As money laundering grew more complex, the mafia adapted by investing heavily in legitimate businesses and front companies across the globe. Real estate, hotels, nightclubs, and luxury car dealerships in major global cities became prime targets for illegal funds, enabling the mafia to integrate their illicit earnings into the global economy. The financial systems of the West banks, hedge funds, and corporate investments offered a seemingly legitimate avenue for the mafia to clean their money, ensuring that their profits were safely tucked away in overseas accounts, away from the prying eyes of law enforcement. These global connections were key to the mafia's dominance. By working with foreign criminal organizations, they were able to consolidate their power, creating an extensive web of criminal and financial operations that spanned continents. The cooperation between Russian mafia groups and other global networks made them not only a regional force but a global one. Winter provided them with the cover and isolation needed to finalize deals and expand their influence internationally. In the end, winter proved to be more than just a time of hardship for the Russian Mafia. It became a period of growth, strategy, and consolidation. The isolation brought on by the cold allowed them to expand their operations and deepen their global influence. Whether it was through smuggling, drug trafficking, money laundering, or the infiltration of political systems, the Mafia thrived during these harsh months, solidifying their position in the global criminal hierarchy. By the time spring arrived, the Mafia had cemented their dominance, using the cover of winter to secure their power both at home and abroad. The cold months became a season of opportunity, and the Russian Mafia proved once again that no obstacle was too great for them to overcome. As you reflect on the rise and evolution of the Russian Mafia, it's clear that their resilience is a defining trait. Despite the brutal winters, the societal upheaval following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the widespread corruption that accompanied the transition to a market economy, the Russian Mafia not only survived but thrived. The harsh winter conditions that many found unbearable were, for the Mafia, an opportunity. The cold, isolation, and long, dark nights allowed the criminal underworld to operate under the radar, growing in strength while the rest of the country struggled with its new reality. The Mafia's adaptability during the winter months, whether through smuggling, extortion, money laundering, or even violent territorial disputes, demonstrates their capacity to exploit every situation to their advantage. What might have been a time of dormancy for others became a period of strategic consolidation and expansion for the Mafia. By utilizing the natural cover provided by the cold, and by capitalizing on the disruptions caused by the harsh weather and the economic instability of post-Soviet Russia, the Mafia solidified its control over key sectors of the economy and established its dominance both within Russia and globally. This resilience in the face of adversity, the ability to continue operations under even the most difficult conditions, has allowed the Russian Mafia to maintain a hold on both the Russian economy and the international criminal network. The Mafia's success lies in its ability to not just survive but thrive in environments where most would have faltered. The Russian winter, which many see as a challenge, became a proving ground for their adaptability and enduring power. As you look deeper into the long-lasting impact of the Russian Mafia, it becomes evident that their influence is not merely a relic of the past, but continues to shape the modern landscape in profound ways. The Mafia's grip on both Russian society and the global criminal underworld has left a legacy that is still felt today. The corruption and criminal networks established by the Mafia during the post-Soviet era have permeated both the economic and political systems of Russia, creating a cycle of power that remains difficult to break. Within Russia, the Mafia's influence continues to impact key sectors of the economy, such as oil, gas, construction, and arms trade. Even though Russia has made strides to modernize its industries, the legacy of the Russian Mafia remains evident, with criminal groups still managing to infiltrate vital industries and establish lucrative monopolies. Business owners, particularly those in vulnerable sectors, often find themselves forced to pay protection money to the Mafia, securing their survival in an environment where corruption and criminal ties remain deeply embedded. The Mafia's ability to adapt and infiltrate these industries often through connections to corrupt officials and politicians, has allowed them to maintain an iron grip on both the economy and political processes in Russia. Globally, the mafia's influence has reached far beyond Russia's borders. Their international criminal network continues to thrive, with operations in drug trafficking, human trafficking, money laundering, and arms dealing reaching across Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and even the Americas. The Russian Mafia has embedded itself in the international criminal ecosystem, forming alliances with other syndicates, both Eastern European and Western, to further their operations. Smuggling routes run through Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and even into North America, making it clear that the Russian Mafia is no longer confined to its home country. The globalization of its criminal activities has only strengthened the Mafia's position in the international criminal underworld. Yet, despite the global reach of the Russian Mafia, their power is not without limitations. The international community, particularly in the West, has become increasingly vigilant in its efforts to combat transnational organized crime. The rise of global policing agencies, international financial institutions, and anti-money laundering initiatives has made it more difficult for the Mafia to operate with the same level of impunity they once did. But even with these challenges, the Mafia's resilience remains unmatched. They have adapted to these changing circumstances by shifting their operations into new markets and adopting more sophisticated methods to launder money and conduct business. Looking ahead, the future of the Russian Mafia will likely evolve as the global political landscape shifts. The changing dynamics in Russia's political system, combined with the increasing efforts of the international community to combat organized crime, will present new challenges. The Russian government's increasing centralization and crackdowns on corruption may limit the Mafia's influence within Russia. However, as history has shown, the Mafia is highly adaptable and will likely continue to find new ways to thrive. The globalization of crime and the advent of new technologies, such as cybercrime and cryptocurrency, could present new opportunities for the Russian Mafia to exploit. Cybercrime is a growing concern for law enforcement worldwide, and criminal organizations like the Russian Mafia are already positioning themselves to capitalize on this new frontier. The use of cryptocurrency for money laundering and illegal transactions has already become a key part of the Mafia's financial activities, allowing them to operate in ways that are more difficult to trace and prosecute. The future evolution of the Russian Mafia will depend largely on their ability to adapt to shifting global realities, whether it be through embracing new technologies, forging new international alliances, or continuing to exploit the political and economic vulnerabilities of countries around the world. Their capacity for survival, even in the face of adversity, ensures that they will remain a significant force in the world of organized crime for years to come. In the end, the Russian Mafia's legacy is one of endurance, adaptability, and strategic foresight. Whether it's through exploiting the challenges posed by harsh winters or capitalizing on shifting political landscapes, the Russian Mafia has demonstrated that it is not just a product of its environment, but a master of manipulating it to secure its own survival. As the world changes, one thing is certain: the Russian Mafia will continue to adapt, evolve, and thrive, ensuring that their influence endures both in Russia and across the globe. As you consider the long-lasting impact of the Russian Mafia, it becomes apparent that their influence continues to shape both modern Russian society and the global criminal underworld. The legacy of the Mafia's operations is deeply ingrained in Russian society. From the Mafia's historical control over critical industries like energy and construction, to their integration into the fabric of Russian politics, the criminal networks have become a permanent fixture. The Mafia has shaped the economic landscape, manipulated the political climate, and left an indelible mark on Russian culture. Their reach doesn't end at Russia's borders. The globalization of the Russian Mafia has made it a force in criminal enterprises worldwide, from drug trafficking in Europe to arms dealing in the Middle East and human trafficking in Asia. The international networks they've built have allowed them to expand their criminal empire, making them one of the most powerful organized crime syndicates in history. Looking ahead, the future of the Russian Mafia may be shaped by changing political dynamics within Russia. As the country's political climate evolves, whether through increased authoritarian control or potential changes in international relations, the Mafia's operations will likely evolve as well. With the rise of cybercrime, money laundering, and digital smuggling, the Mafia may adapt by shifting their focus to more sophisticated, less detectable methods of crime. Additionally, the Mafia's long-standing relationships with politicians and business elites may continue to protect their operations, even as the global community becomes more vigilant in its efforts to combat transnational organized crime. The Russian Mafia, however, has shown time and time again that it can adapt to shifting circumstances. As long as there is opportunity in the fractured political systems and global networks, the Mafia will find ways to thrive. The lessons learned from surviving the harsh Russian winters will likely continue to guide their methods, ensuring that they remain a dominant force in both the criminal world and the global economy. The future of the Russian Mafia may change in form, but its power, influence, and resilience will remain a key feature of both Russia and the international underworld for years to come. As you reflect on the Russian Mafia's enduring presence, it's clear that their adaptability is their most formidable trait. Despite changing political landscapes and the increasing global focus on combating organized crime, they remain a constant force, thriving in the face of adversity, much like they did during the harsh Russian winters. The legacy they've left in Russia and the world will continue to echo through history, evolving with new challenges and opportunities. The future may look different, but the Mafia's power, influence, and resilience will remain indomitable. As the night falls and the cold winds sweep across the land, remember that even in the darkest of times, there are forces at play in the shadows, shaping the course of history. With the stillness of the winter night, take a moment to let go of the day's thoughts. Let the quiet calmness of the world around you ease your mind. May your dreams be peaceful, free from the struggles of the waking world. Sleep well, and let the stories of the past, with all their complexity and intrigue, guide you to a restful slumber. Good night.